Story number 1.
It was late in the season when the Jefferson High School Eagles had their most important game of the year. The district championship was on the line, and the atmosphere was electric. The stadium was packed to the brim with fans cheering, the band playing, and the tension hanging thick in the air. They had been working toward this moment for years. The town had waited decades for another chance at victory. The team was hungry for it, and they were close. But as the sun set and the lights flickered on over the field, something shifted. Something in the air felt off, like the stadium itself was holding its breath. For Brian Hayes, the quarterback of the Eagles, this game was more than just a chance to lead his team to victory. It was about redemption. Brian had been a rising star ever since his sophomore year, but it had all been marred by a tragic injury during his junior season. A torn ACL had left him on the sidelines for the entire year, watching his team lose their shot at the championship. His return to the field this season had been triumphant, but there was still the shadow of that past injury hanging over him. The championship was his moment to prove that he was back, stronger than ever. As the final whistle blew, signaling the start of the game, Brian stood tall with his team, his eyes scanning the packed stands, his body buzzing with adrenaline. The air was crisp, and the stadium lights shone down brightly, casting long shadows across the field. There was something about the place that felt different today. The energy felt heavier, as though the stadium itself was alive with anticipation. The first quarter passed in a blur of action. The Eagles were playing well. The other team, the Westfield Wolves, was putting up a strong fight, but Brian's throws were sharp, and his receivers were making impressive catches. Everything seemed perfect. The crowd roared after every touchdown, and the players fed off the energy of their supporters. But as the game wore on, Brian started to feel a growing unease. It started with small things, an odd sound here or there, a flicker of light that didn't seem to have a reason for it. At one point, as Brian looked down the field, he swore he saw a figure standing near the goalposts, just standing there, motionless. It was only for a second, and when he blinked, the figure was gone. He shook it off, thinking it was a trick of the lights or his mind playing games with him under the stress of the game. But then, during a timeout in the second quarter, the unease escalated. As Brian was sitting on the bench, catching his breath and listening to his coach's instructions, he felt a cold breeze brush past him. It was sudden, biting, and out of place given the warmth of the evening. He looked around at his teammates, but no one else seemed to notice. He glanced toward the stands, and for just a moment he thought he saw a pair of eyes locked on him from the shadows under the bleachers. His heart skipped a beat. Something was wrong. He couldn't explain it, but it felt as if someone, or something, was watching him. He had heard the stories. The legends of the stadium that had been passed down through generations. The eerie tales of strange occurrences during games, of players vanishing in the middle of the night, and of the ghost of a former star quarterback who had died under mysterious circumstances after a tragic accident years ago. But Brian was skeptical, dismissing the stories as nothing more than superstition. That is, until now. The game continued, and the Eagles managed to build a small lead against the Wolves, but Brian could not shake the feeling that something was watching him. Every pass he threw felt off. Every play felt like it was being interfered with by an invisible force. His teammates noticed his unease, but none of them dared to say anything. They were focused on the game, trying to maintain their advantage. Then came the third quarter. Brian had just thrown a touchdown pass that seemed to secure the game. He felt the adrenaline surge through his body as he ran off the field, but as he passed the sideline, he heard it. A whisper. Clear as day, though no one was close enough to speak to him. "Don't think you can escape." Brian froze mid-step. He looked around, but no one was near him. His coach was yelling instructions, his teammates were celebrating, but the voice, cold and chilling, echoed in his mind. "Who said that?" he whispered to himself, glancing over his shoulder. But there was no one there, just empty air. He shook his head, trying to clear the thought, but it lingered, gnawing at him. The game resumed, but his focus was no longer on the football. Instead, his mind raced, trying to make sense of what had just happened. He couldn't deny it. There was someone on this field with them. The fourth quarter began, and the game was tight. The Wolves had closed the gap, and the Eagles were only one touchdown ahead. The pressure was mounting, and Brian could feel his nerves beginning to fray. As he lined up behind the center, ready for the next play, he looked down the field and saw it again. The figure, the one he had glimpsed earlier. It stood at the edge of the field, just beyond the end zone, staring at him with an intensity that made his skin crawl. The figure was a man in an old football uniform, faded with age, but there was something wrong about him. His movements were stiff, unnatural, as though he wasn't entirely alive. Brian's hand shook as he gripped the football. His breath caught in his throat. He knew he had to keep his focus on the game, but the figure wouldn't leave his mind. He tried to ignore it, tried to push it to the back of his mind, but the figure remained, like a shadow in his peripheral vision. Suddenly, the figure took a step forward, moving toward the field. Brian blinked. The figure was closer now, much closer. And then, just as quickly, the lights above the field flickered and everything went dark. The crowd fell silent, and there was an eerie stillness in the air. Brian stood there, frozen, his heart pounding in his chest. The lights came back on a moment later, but the figure was gone. The field was empty. It was as if the darkness had swallowed him whole. "Is everything all right, Hayes?" his coach asked, breaking the silence. Brian didn't answer immediately. He was too shaken to speak. He could feel his breath coming in short bursts, his hands trembling at his sides. "Yeah, coach," he finally said, his voice shaking slightly. "I'm good." But he wasn't good. Not at all. The game resumed, but Brian's mind was no longer in the game. It was on that figure, on the strange things that had been happening. The next series was a blur. Brian barely remembered the plays, barely remembered the touchdowns. He was running on autopilot, his body moving mechanically as the game wore on. The clock ticked down, and with each passing second, the tension in the air grew thicker. When the final whistle blew, signaling their victory, Brian's teammates erupted into celebration. They had won the championship. But Brian didn't feel the same rush of joy that everyone else did. All he could think about was the figure. The feeling that something was not right with the stadium, that something, someone, had been there with them the entire time. After the celebration had ended and the team had gathered in the locker room, Brian made his way out to the field once again. He couldn't shake the feeling that he needed answers. He had to know what had happened, what had been haunting him and the stadium. The air was cold now, much colder than it had been before the game. The lights above flickered, casting an eerie glow across the empty field. He walked slowly, taking in every detail. The rusted bleachers, the weathered goalposts, the faint sound of wind stirring the fallen leaves. And then, from the corner of his eye, he saw it again. The figure, standing at the edge of the field, motionless, staring at him. Brian's heart pounded in his chest as he walked toward the figure, his breath coming in shallow gasps. As he drew closer, the figure remained still, never once moving or acknowledging his presence. Brian stood there, his eyes locked on the ghostly form until the figure suddenly faded into the shadows, disappearing without a trace. He didn't know what it meant or what the ghost was trying to tell him. But as he turned and walked off the field that night, Brian Hayes knew that he would never forget the events of that championship game. The stadium, once a place of pride, had now become a place of fear. And the ghost, whatever it was, would continue to haunt the field long after the game had ended. Story the end.
Story number 2.
The night air was unusually still, and the usual chatter of the nearby fans was absent. The field was empty now, the stadium lights casting their cold, bright light over the expanse of grass. The echoes of the game earlier in the evening still lingered. Shouts from players, cheers from fans, the sharp sound of the whistle. But now the only sound was the occasional hum of the old flickering stadium lights above. Jonah Richards stood at the edge of the field, watching as his teammates trudged off toward the locker room. Their victory in the final game of the season had earned them a well-deserved break, and the coaches had been the first to leave, eager to get back to their homes. Jonah, however, was lingering behind. His mind was not entirely on the game. It had been a brutal match, but his thoughts were elsewhere. His legs were sore, his jersey soaked with sweat, but there was something about this stadium that never let him go. Something about this field made him uneasy. He wasn't the only one. Over the past few years, strange rumors had circulated about the place. No one could ever confirm anything, but Jonah had heard the stories. It wasn't just about the unexplainable things that had happened on the field during games, like equipment going missing or strange cold spots near the end zones. It was the legend of the former star quarterback, Adam Wallace, who had died during a practice match, and mysteriously and without any apparent reason. Jonah had heard his teammates joking about it in passing, laughing it off as just a story to scare the younger players. But there was something about it that never sat right with him. Jonah remembered hearing the rumors when he first joined the team 3 years ago. Coaches would tell them to keep their eyes on the field, to not wander during late practices. Some of the seniors had claimed to see shadows moving during night games, figures standing in the corners of their vision that weren't there when they looked again. Most chalked it up to exhaustion or the stress of the game. But Jonah couldn't shake the feeling that the field was different. He had always been the type to ignore the supernatural, focusing instead on what he could see and touch. He was a realist, a skeptic. But even tonight, after the game, something felt off. As the rest of the team celebrated in the locker room, Jonah stepped out onto the field for a brief moment of solitude. He wanted to clear his head, get some air, and maybe think about the game. But as he stood alone in the quiet of the empty stadium, he felt it. The sudden shift in temperature, the way the air grew heavier. He took a deep breath and began walking across the field, making his way toward the 50-yard line where he often stood during halftime breaks, gathering his thoughts. It was then that he heard it, the unmistakable sound of cleats scraping against the grass behind him. He stopped mid-step and turned around, but there was no one there. His pulse quickened and his throat tightened. Jonah laughed nervously to himself. "Get a grip, Jonah," he muttered under his breath. But when he turned back around, there was something there, someone standing at the edge of the field, just beyond the end zone. He froze. The figure stood perfectly still, wearing a jersey that looked decades old, the fabric torn and faded. Jonah couldn't make out the person's face. The shadows of the stadium obscured it. But the figure was unmistakably there, standing motionless under the lights. Jonah could feel his heart racing in his chest. "Hello?" Jonah called out, his voice trembling despite his attempts to sound casual. "Anyone there?" No answer. His instincts screamed at him to run. He felt a cold draft sweep over him, sending a chill through his body. He couldn't explain it, but everything about this moment felt wrong. The figure remained still, staring into the distance, unmoving. Jonah's legs locked in place as if he couldn't bring himself to turn away. The wind picked up again, rustling the leaves near the fence that bordered the field. It carried with it an eerie, almost whispering sound. Jonah glanced around, but the stadium, though filled with history and the weight of memories, now felt empty and abandoned. He felt utterly alone. Then, without warning, the figure took a single step forward, its cleats scraping loudly against the turf. Jonah's heart lurched in his chest. He had no idea why, but he was paralyzed, rooted to the spot. The figure continued to move toward him, each step slower and more deliberate than the last. As it got closer, Jonah saw more detail. The uniform, the old helmet, the faded number. And then, just as he thought his legs would give out, the figure stopped just a few feet in front of him. The air around Jonah seemed to go cold, freezing him in place. His breath caught in his throat as the figure raised its head slightly, revealing a face. The face was pale, hollow-eyed, and disfigured, as though it had been burned or ravaged by time. Jonah's stomach turned. He wanted to scream, but his voice was caught in his chest. And then, in a raspy, echoing voice, the figure whispered, "Get out!" Jonah stumbled backward, tripping over his own feet. His body moved without thinking, and he ran. He bolted for the gate, his feet pounding against the turf, his pulse racing in his ears. He didn't dare to look back, but as he ran, he could feel the air grow warmer again, and the sensation of being watched never left him. It was as if the very ground beneath his feet was pressing down on him, unwilling to let him leave. When Jonah finally reached the locker room, he slammed the door shut behind him and locked it, his breathing ragged. He couldn't tell anyone what he had just seen. He would sound insane, or worse, like he was imagining it. But he knew what he had seen. The ghost of Adam Wallace. Everyone on the team knew the stories. Adam had been the star quarterback of the team in the 1980s until one fateful day during practice when something went terribly wrong. No one could explain it. He had simply collapsed, dead before anyone could reach him. They said it was an accident, a freak occurrence. But Jonah didn't believe it. He had always suspected that something more had happened that day, something that no one wanted to talk about. Maybe, just maybe, Adam had never left the field. The next day, Jonah couldn't shake the feeling of dread that clung to him. He went through the motions, attending practice and trying to focus on his plays, but the memory of the figure, the ghost, kept coming back to him. It wasn't just a one-time thing, he realized. The team had been cursed. Adam Wallace was still watching, still lingering on that field. As the days went by, Jonah couldn't avoid the strange occurrences that started happening to him and his teammates. Equipment went missing in the locker room. Helmets, jerseys, and cleats were found tossed aside, as if someone had been there. The lights in the locker room would flicker on and off even when the building was empty. Some players even said they heard whispers coming from the showers, but when they went to investigate, no one was ever there. One evening after practice, Jonah decided to confront the rumors head-on. He stayed late long after the coaches and teammates had left. He wanted to understand. He wanted to know what had happened to Adam Wallace. He made his way down to the field, alone this time, just as the night was beginning to fall. The lights buzzed overhead, casting an unnatural glow over the turf. Jonah walked across the field, the cool wind rustling the trees along the perimeter. It was eerily quiet. Then, just like before, he heard the sound, the faint scraping of cleats against the grass, soft at first, but gradually louder. Jonah didn't turn around. He stood still in the center of the field, heart hammering in his chest. The whispers started again, distant at first, but growing closer. His breath quickened, his palms slick with sweat, and then the voice again, the raspy whisper from the figure. Leave. Now. Jonah's legs finally moved. He ran, not looking back, not slowing down, until he had reached the gates of the stadium. He couldn't explain it, but he knew deep down that Adam Wallace was still there, trapped in the very soul of that field. He left that night, vowing never to return. But the image of the ghost, the pale, hollow-eyed face, stayed with him long after. The stadium, which had once held the hopes of young athletes chasing their dreams, was now forever haunted by the past. The ghost of Adam Wallace would never leave, not until the truth of his death was revealed. Story the end.
Story number 3.
It was the year 1987, and the town of Springdale was filled with the excitement of its annual rivalry football game. The Springdale High Tigers had been at the top of their game for years, and the matchup with their biggest competitors, the Westfield Wolves, was always the highlight of the season. Every year, the game drew crowds from both sides of the towns, eager to witness the long-standing tradition and rivalry between the teams. But that year, something was different. The stadium, which had seen hundreds of games, seemed to have a strange energy surrounding it. There was a heavy fog that rolled in early that evening, blanketing the field in an eerie mist as the teams prepared for the game. The air felt colder than usual, and the usual excitement in the crowd seemed subdued, as if something unspoken hung in the air. Coach Graham, the longtime coach of the Tigers, had seen it all: highs, lows, victories, and devastating losses. But this season, he had been struggling with a secret that weighed heavily on his mind. It wasn't just the usual nerves before a big game. This was something different, something that felt wrong. Coach Graham had always been a man of reason, believing that hard work and discipline were the keys to success. But lately, he'd been plagued by strange occurrences. It started with subtle things: a flickering light in the locker room, the feeling that someone was standing behind him when no one was there, the low whispers he couldn't quite make out. But the most disturbing was the dream he kept having, of a man dressed in an old-fashioned football uniform, his face obscured by shadow, standing on the sideline, watching the game with intense, unblinking eyes. The dream had been repeating for weeks, and every time it came, Coach Graham would wake in a cold sweat, heart racing, as if the figure in his dream was somehow connected to the fate of his team. He tried to shake it off, dismissing it as stress. After all, he had coached more than 200 games, and superstitions were a part of the game. But this This felt different. As game time approached, the tension in the air was palpable. The players were getting ready in the locker room, their jerseys and pads on, their faces painted with the usual war paint that symbolized the rivalry between the Tigers and the Wolves. Coach Graham paced back and forth, trying to push the nagging thoughts from his mind, but every time he looked up, his gaze would wander to the locker room door, as if someone, was watching him. "Coach," a voice broke through his thoughts. It was Jeff, his star quarterback, standing in the doorway, his helmet in hand. "You okay? You look like you've seen a ghost." Coach Graham forced a smile, though it didn't reach his eyes. "Just the usual pregame nerves, Jeff. Nothing to worry about." Jeff raised an eyebrow. "If you say so. But you know we've got this, right? We've been working too hard to let them take us down." Coach Graham nodded, but his mind was elsewhere. He had to focus. This game meant everything, and if his players were to have any chance of winning, he couldn't afford to let his fears get the best of him. The teams took the field as the sun dipped below the horizon, the stadium lights flickering to life as the crowd erupted in cheers. The sound of marching bands, cheerleaders, and clapping fans filled the air, but Coach Graham couldn't shake the unsettling feeling that had settled in his chest. As the first quarter unfolded, the game was intense. Both teams were evenly matched, with no clear advantage. The Tigers were putting up a fight, but the Wolves were equally determined, each play bringing the teams closer to a breaking point. Coach Graham paced the sideline, shouting instructions, trying to keep his players focused, but every so often, his eyes would drift to the far side of the field. It was there that he saw it, the figure. At first, it was just a blur, a shadow standing on the edge of the field near the end zone. The figure wore a dark, old-fashioned football uniform, the kind that looked out of place in a modern game. It was a strange thing to notice in the midst of a high school football game, but as the seconds passed, Coach Graham couldn't look away. The figure was watching the game with a focused intensity, its gaze never leaving the action on the field. There was something familiar about it, something unsettlingly haunting. Coach Graham tried to brush it off, telling himself it was just a trick of the light, a figment of his imagination. But as the game went on, the figure remained, standing eerily still, unmoving, as if waiting for something. During halftime, the coaches gathered in the locker room, discussing strategy for the second half, but Coach Graham couldn't concentrate. His mind kept returning to the figure, to the strange feeling that had begun to gnaw at him. He stood up abruptly, interrupting the conversation. "I need to take a walk," he said, his voice terse. "Coach, you sure you're all right?" Jeff asked, looking concerned. Coach Graham nodded. "I'll be fine. Just need a moment." He walked out of the locker room and made his way toward the edge of the stadium. The fog had thickened, and the field looked like something from a nightmare, shrouded in mist and shadows. The lights cast long, eerie beams, and the hum of the crowd was muffled by the fog. It was almost as if the entire world had quieted down, leaving only the noise of his footsteps and his racing thoughts. As he reached the edge of the field, near the end zone where the figure had been standing, Coach Graham stopped. His breath caught in his throat. There, standing at the far end of the field, was the figure once again, but this time it was closer, much closer. The man was standing just beyond the end zone, his eyes fixed on Coach Graham. He looked like a player from another time, his uniform old and worn, with the name Callahan faintly visible on the back. "Who are you?" Coach Graham whispered, his voice trembling. The figure didn't respond. It simply stood there, staring. Suddenly, the sound of a whistle cut through the air. Coach Graham spun around, and when he looked back, the figure was gone. He blinked, disoriented, as the fog began to recede. The field seemed just as it should be, but the unease lingered in his chest. It felt as if something had been stolen from him. Something important. Coach Graham returned to the locker room, his mind racing, but he didn't say a word. The rest of the game played out in a blur. The Tigers were playing hard, but something was off. Their energy was lagging, and every play felt like they were running out of steam. The Wolves were pushing hard, but the Tigers couldn't keep up. The third quarter ended, and the Tigers were down by 2 touchdowns. By the fourth quarter, Coach Graham could barely focus. The figure, Callahan, was in his mind constantly. He could hear the name in his head, a name that seemed to echo through the mist. It was a name from the past, a name he didn't understand, but it felt important. It was then that he realized the name Callahan wasn't just a name. It was a player who had been part of the team decades ago, someone who had disappeared under mysterious circumstances. The story had been a local legend for years, a tragedy that no one could quite explain. Callahan had been a star player, but one night, during a game much like this one, he had vanished without a trace. No one had ever found him, and the game had been suspended. Coach Graham's heart raced as the realization hit him. The game wasn't just about winning. It was about finishing something that had been left unfinished all those years ago. Callahan's spirit had been trapped, bound to the field, waiting for the game to be completed. As the clock ticked down in the fourth quarter, the Tigers were down by 1 point. It was their final possession, and the stadium was filled with tension. Jeff, the quarterback, called the play. It was a long shot, but it was the only play that had any chance of winning the game. The ball was snapped, and Jeff sprinted back, scanning the field for an open receiver. But then, in that moment, it happened. Coach Graham saw him again, Callahan. The figure was standing in the end zone, waiting. He wasn't just a ghost, he was a part of the game, a silent player whose presence was felt with every step. With a last, desperate throw, Jeff launched the ball toward the end zone. It spiraled through the air, the crowd holding its breath. Time seemed to slow as the ball soared toward the waiting receiver. The entire stadium fell silent as the ball descended, and then, just as the receiver leaped into the air, the ball dropped into his hands. The Tigers had won. The crowd erupted into cheers, but Coach Graham felt nothing but emptiness. The game was over, but the figure of Callahan lingered in his mind. It was finished, for now. But Coach Graham knew that the town of Springdale would never be the same again. Story the end.
Story number 4.
The first time I stepped onto the field at Old Mill Stadium, I thought it was just like any other high school football game. The energy was electric, the crowd was loud, and my teammates were hyped for what was supposed to be our biggest game of the season. We were playing against our biggest rival, Millfield High, and the atmosphere was so charged that it almost felt like the world had narrowed down to just us, the field, and the ball. As the starting quarterback, it was my job to keep the team focused, and the pressure was on. But I felt confident. This was my year. I had been training all summer, and I had the support of my team. The night sky was clear, the air cool and crisp as the lights above us blazed to life. Everything felt perfect. The field had been freshly lined, and you could smell the faint scent of the grass mixed with the sweet, familiar aroma of popcorn from the stands. The kind of smell that made everything feel like it was exactly where it was supposed to be. But as I took my first snap under center, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. I tried to push it to the back of my mind. We had a game to win, after all. But with every play, with every touchdown we scored, that strange feeling only seemed to grow. It started with the little things. The crowd, while usually rowdy and involved, seemed distant that night. Their cheers didn't feel as genuine, and the noises seemed muffled, like the voices were coming from far away. The lights, too, seemed a little too bright, the field a little too dark around the edges, but it was subtle enough that no one else seemed to notice. And there were moments, brief flashes, really, when I thought I saw someone moving at the far end of the field, just out of the corner of my eye. At first, I assumed it was just my imagination, a result of the adrenaline and pressure. But the more I played, the harder it became to ignore. There was an eerie stillness that clung to the field in the moments between plays. A few times, when I called for the ball or shouted for the snap, it seemed like the echoes from my voice didn't quite come back to me. It was like they were swallowed up by the field. And even the other players seemed a bit more distant than usual. They moved in a robotic, automatic way, their eyes glassy and unfocused, almost as if they were playing out of habit rather than actual desire. But nothing could have prepared me for what happened just before halftime. We were up by 2 touchdowns, but Millfield had started gaining ground in the second quarter. I called a play, ready to march us down the field again, but when I turned to the sideline for the call from the coaches, something stopped me. There, in the stands, standing alone in the farthest corner near the entrance, was a man. His face was obscured by the darkness, but his figure was unmistakable. Tall, wearing a weathered old football uniform, the number hard to make out in the dim light. His posture was rigid, unnatural. The crowd around him was oblivious, continuing to cheer and scream, but there was something so wrong about the way this man stood. He didn't belong there. I felt a cold wave wash over me as my stomach twisted into a knot. I thought about ignoring it, but I couldn't. I kept looking at him, trying to make out more details. He didn't move, didn't blink, just stared straight ahead. I snapped myself back into the game, telling myself it was just nerves. But as I turned back toward the field, my heart skipped a beat. The moment my eyes left the man, I saw something else. Something even stranger. Near the goal line on the opposite side of the field, a Millfield player, was standing still, far from the action. He was facing the end zone, his hands at his sides, unmoving. He wasn't part of the play, wasn't even in the right position. The other players seemed to be oblivious to him, running around him without a second glance. My eyes locked on him, and I felt a sudden, overwhelming sense of dread. That's when I realized something that chilled me to my core. The player was wearing an old, faded number 23 jersey, the same number worn by a former player from our school, a star quarterback named Zachary Miller. Zach had died in a car accident several years ago. He was a hero of the school, one of the best athletes we'd ever seen. His death had shocked everyone. The whole town mourned him for weeks, and the tragedy was never far from anyone's mind. But seeing that jersey on the field, that was wrong. That wasn't possible. I tried to shake it off, but I couldn't. My hands were shaking and my throat had gone dry. I needed to focus on the game, but every instinct told me to look away from that player. And yet, I couldn't stop staring. Suddenly, the whistle blew, signaling the start of the next play. I snapped back to reality, my heart racing as I realized the ball was being handed to me. I had to play. I had to lead my team. I called out the signals, trying to ignore the rising panic in my chest. But something strange happened when I threw the ball. The moment my arm released it, everything seemed to slow down. The ball hung in the air longer than it should have. Time seemed to stretch and warp, and for an instant I thought I saw the field shimmer. A mirage, a distortion in the lights. The pass sailed through the air and landed perfectly in the hands of my receiver, who caught it for a touchdown. The crowd erupted in cheers, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something had gone horribly wrong. I looked down at my hands, wondering if it was the nerves or something more, but I couldn't focus on the game anymore. The man in the stands, the player in the old jersey, everything was too real, too wrong. When the game ended and the final whistle blew, the adrenaline of the win wore off, but the dread didn't leave me. I told myself I would sleep it off, put it behind me. After all, we had won, right? Everything had gone fine, but I couldn't stop thinking about that figure in the stands, or the player I'd seen standing alone on the field. That night, I couldn't sleep. The image of the man in the stands kept replaying in my mind, his empty gaze fixed on me. I kept hearing the whispers in my head as if someone was talking just out of reach, their voice drowned out by the roar of the crowd. I tried to dismiss it, but I couldn't. I knew what I had seen, and I knew that something was wrong with Old Mill Stadium. I tried to ignore the feeling for a few weeks. After all, the team had a great run after that game. We made it to the state finals, and everything seemed like it was finally coming together. But the strange occurrences kept piling up. Little things at first, players hearing voices in the locker room, strange cold spots on the field that didn't seem to have any logical explanation. But then it started happening to me. During the championship game, as we neared the final minutes of the fourth quarter, I noticed the field was eerily quiet. The crowd, usually so loud and energetic, was silent. The cheering had stopped and the air felt thick. When I looked toward the sideline, I saw it again, the man in the stands. But this time, he wasn't standing. He was walking toward the field. I felt my legs turn to jelly and my stomach dropped. The ball snapped and I threw the pass, but my eyes were still fixed on the figure approaching. This time he wasn't just standing there. He was coming closer, closer, closer. I could see his face now. His features were distorted as if caught between two worlds. Alive but not alive. His eyes, dark and hollow, were locked on me. His lips didn't move, but I could hear his voice inside my head. "You don't belong here." I froze. unable to move. The play continued, but I wasn't part of it anymore. Everything was out of focus, like I was watching from outside my body. I couldn't breathe, couldn't think. All I could hear was the voice in my head telling me to leave. The moment I snapped back into my body, I looked around. My receiver had caught the pass, and the touchdown had been made. The game was over, but I wasn't celebrating. I wasn't even paying attention to the cheers or the sound of the whistle. I was only focused on the man, no, the ghost in the stands. I knew then, without a doubt, that something was wrong with that field. Something had been there long before I ever stepped foot on it. And now it was clear. The ghost of Zachary Miller, the former quarterback, was not just a legend. He was real, and he would not rest until he had taken what was his. I didn't return to the field after that night. My teammates went on to win the state championship, but I couldn't escape the feeling that something dark had followed me. The stadium had claimed something of mine that night, something I would never be able to get back. The field that once felt like home was now a place of dread, a place haunted by a past I couldn't outrun. Story the end.
Story number 5.
The night was unusually cold for a late September evening in the small town of Crescent Ridge, a place known for its sleepy atmosphere, its quiet streets, and the rich tradition of high school football. The Crescent Ridge Cougars had been a force in the state for as long as anyone could remember, a team built on toughness and a sense of pride that ran deep in the town's veins. But it hadn't always been this way. For years, the Cougars were known for their heartbreaks and near misses, falling just short of championship season after season. The town, although loyal, had grown weary. That was until Coach Sam Allen came into the picture in the late 1970s. Coach Allen was a hard man, a man whose eyes seemed to pierce through you, who ran his practices with such discipline that it felt like every player on the field was in constant motion. Under his guidance, the Cougars went from underdogs to the top of the league, winning state championships and putting Crescent Ridge on the map. But Coach Allen's success was not without its cost. It was in 1983, during one of the most intense rivalries in high school football, that tragedy struck. The Cougars were up against the Oakfield Bears, another powerhouse team. The game was tied, and the tension was at its peak. Coach Allen's star player, Alex "Red" Carson, was the pride of Crescent Ridge. A running back with unmatched speed, Red was known for his aggressive style and determination. But as the fourth quarter ticked down and the Cougars neared the end zone, disaster struck. In a moment of chaos, as Red was breaking through the line, he was tackled hard. Too hard. The crowd fell silent as he hit the ground. The game continued, but no one seemed to notice what was happening on the sideline. Coaches rushed over to Red, but by the time they reached him, he was already unconscious, his body limp, his face pale. Paramedics arrived on the field, but there was nothing they could do. Red Carson was pronounced dead shortly after. The town of Crescent Ridge never fully recovered from that night. The Cougars had won the game, but at a cost that could never be measured. Coach Allen, a man who had lived and breathed football, was never the same. He retired soon after the tragedy, his passion for the game seemingly extinguished. The Cougars, under new leadership, continued to perform well, but the spirit of the team was never quite the same. As the years passed, the story of Red's death became part of local lore, an unspoken shadow that haunted the town. Fast forward to the present day, it was the 25th anniversary of that fateful game, and the Cougars were once again gearing up for their rivalry game against Oakfield. The atmosphere in Crescent Ridge was electric, with the stadium filled to the brim with fans. The new generation of Cougars was determined to make their mark, and they had a strong team to do it. But this season was different. The players and coaches, even the alumni who came back to support the team, had a sense that something was not right. Evan Blake, a senior and the starting quarterback, was one of the top players on the team. He had always dreamed of leading the Cougars to a state championship, and this year seemed like the perfect opportunity. But Evan, like many of the players, had heard the whispers. The story of Red Carson's death had been passed down through the generations, and it hung over the team like a dark cloud. The seniors had even joked about it, but there was an undeniable feeling of dread in the air as the game approached. On the day before the game, Evan and his teammates were practicing late into the night. The usual drills had been completed, and now they were running through final plays under the stadium lights. The air was thick with tension, and the field, bathed in the harsh glow of the floodlights, looked surreal, like a stage set for a performance they couldn't control. Evan was running a passing drill when he felt a chill run down his spine. At first, he thought it was just the cold night air, but then he saw it. A figure standing at the far end of the field, near the bleachers. It was a tall, broad-shouldered man dressed in an old-fashioned football uniform, the kind that hadn't been worn in decades. The uniform was dark red with white stripes, almost exactly like the ones the team used to wear back in the 1980s. But there was something wrong about it. The figure stood still, staring at the field, and as Evan's eyes locked onto him, the man's head slowly turned to face him. Evan froze. The figure didn't move, but Evan felt a sudden, intense presence. It was as if the man was watching him, waiting. Evan's heart began to race, and for a moment he couldn't look away. He turned to his coach, but when he looked back, the figure was gone. "Everything okay, Evan?" Coach Harris called out from the sidelines, his voice cutting through the air. Evan blinked, shaking his head. "Yeah, Coach. Just a little distracted. I'm good." But as the night wore on, the strange feeling didn't leave him. It was as if something was lurking just beyond his reach, something tied to the game, something tied to the town's history. When practice finally ended, Evan couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. It felt like the past was alive, lingering in the shadows, waiting for something. That night, Evan couldn't sleep. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw the figure from the field, his haunting gaze following him through the darkness. When he finally drifted off to sleep, he dreamt of running through the fog, the sounds of football pads clashing around him. In the dream, he could hear the faint sound of a whistle, then a voice, faint but clear, calling his name. "Evan, Evan Blake. You have to finish what was started." Evan awoke with a start, drenched in sweat. He looked around his room, his heart pounding. The sun hadn't even come up yet. He checked his phone, still hours before the game. But he couldn't shake the feeling that something was calling him, that something was waiting for him on the field. Game day arrived, and with it came a sense of anticipation and dread. The stands were packed, the air thick with excitement as both teams took the field. Crescent Ridge and Oakfield had been rivals for decades, and the intensity of the game was palpable. But Evan, who had always been calm under pressure, couldn't shake the eerie feeling that had been gnawing at him for the past 24 hours. The first half of the game went as expected, fast-paced and intense. The Cougars were leading, but every time Evan looked toward the end zone, he could see the figure again, standing in the distance, just outside the stadium lights. He tried to focus on the game, but it was impossible to ignore the feeling that someone or something was watching him. As the second half began, the Cougars were ahead by a touchdown. The game was within their grasp, but as Evan lined up for the next play, he felt a sudden cold breeze sweep across the field. The air seemed to shift, and he couldn't help but look toward the end zone. There, standing at the 50-yard line, was the figure again. This time, he wasn't alone. There were other figures, dozens of them, all wearing old-fashioned football uniforms. They stood silently, watching the game unfold. Evan's breath caught in his throat. The figures were not moving, but they were there, all of them, like silent spectators to a game they had once played. It wasn't until the fourth quarter, with only minutes left in the game, that the eerie events reached their peak. Evan, running a quarterback draw, had broken through the line and was barreling toward the end zone. The stadium was filled with noise, the crowd cheering as the final seconds ticked down. But as Evan reached the 10-yard line, the air seemed to grow impossibly thick. The figures on the field were closing in, their presence growing stronger with each step he took. And then, as if guided by something beyond his control, Evan found himself back at the 50-yard line, staring at the figures, unable to move. His heart pounded in his chest and the whispers filled his ears. "You have to finish it. Finish what was started." The whistle blew, signaling the end of the game, and as the crowd erupted in cheers, Evan stood motionless, staring at the figures, who slowly began to fade, disappearing into the fog that had settled on the field. The Cougars had won, but Evan knew something had changed. The game, the victory, none of it felt real. As he walked off the field, the whispers lingered and the ghostly figures remained with him, watching, waiting. Evan would never forget that night, the night that was not just about football, but about something much older, something tied to the very soul of Crescent Ridge. Story the end.
Story number 6.
The clock read 11:45 p.m., and the gymnasium lights buzzed above, casting long shadows across the empty basketball court. Jason Harris, a 17-year-old senior, sat on the bleachers in the quiet, almost eerie silence of the school's gym. The hardwood floor had been freshly polished for the big game the following night, but tonight it felt like a place abandoned by time. He ran his hand through his short, dark hair and let out a heavy sigh. The pressure had been mounting all season. It was the district championship game, and the Ridgeway High Falcons had a solid chance to finally win after years of coming close. But there was something nagging at Jason, something he couldn't quite explain. The stories, the rumors, the warnings. Ever since he was a freshman, Jason had heard the tale, passed down by older players about the haunted gymnasium at Ridgeway High. They spoke of a long-forgotten tragedy, something that happened decades ago, something that no one would dare mention in polite company, but that everyone knew all too well. It was 1968, and the Ridgeway Falcons were a dominant force in the district, led by their star player, Tommy Wells. Tommy was the kind of player who made the crowd go wild, the kind of talent who could take over a game single-handedly. He had the speed, the skills, the vision, and the heart. But there was a darkness surrounding Tommy's life. His father had been a former professional athlete who had fallen on hard times, and the pressure he placed on Tommy to succeed was unimaginable. On the night of the final game, everything seemed perfect. The Falcons were up by just a few points, but Tommy was in the zone, sinking basket after basket. As the seconds wound down in the fourth quarter, the crowd was on its feet. Ridgeway High was on the verge of winning its first ever district championship in basketball history. But something went terribly wrong. With just 5 seconds left on the clock, Tommy went for a dunk, leaping high into the air. And then, in what felt like slow motion, something snapped. A sickening, audible crack echoed through the gymnasium as Tommy landed awkwardly on his leg. His knee buckled under the weight, and he crumpled to the floor in agony. The crowd fell silent. The final buzzer went off, but no one celebrated. The game was over, but Tommy Wells' career had ended in an instant. The diagnosis was grim. Tommy had suffered a compound fracture to his leg, a career-ending injury. But it wasn't just the injury that broke Tommy. His father's fury had boiled over, turning into physical and emotional abuse. The stories said that Tommy, broken by the constant pressure and the loss of his dreams, had wandered the gym one final time, taking his own life in the very place where he had once felt his greatest joy. Some claimed to have heard his voice, faint but distinct, echoing through the gym long after he was gone. Jason shook his head, trying to shake the thoughts from his mind. He had heard the stories too many times to count, but he had never truly believed them. Until now. He stood up from the bleachers, feeling the weight of his team's expectations on his shoulders. They needed to win tomorrow night. He needed to win. He couldn't let this ghost story get in his head. It was just a story, nothing more. He told himself that over and over as he walked toward the court, the hardwood beneath his sneakers creaking with each step. As Jason took a few practice shots, he began to feel a strange presence in the air. It was almost as if the gym itself was watching him. He couldn't explain it, but his every movement felt slower, more deliberate, as if someone or something was pushing him to perform better. His shots were going in, every one of them, as if guided by some unseen force. Jason smiled, impressed by his own precision. But that's when he heard it. A faint sound, almost inaudible, echoed through the gym. It was a basketball bouncing on the court. Jason froze, his heart hammering in his chest. He looked around, but no one was there. The gym was still empty, save for the dim lights and the sound of his breathing. He took another shot, trying to ignore the sensation of eyes watching him. But the bounce came again, louder this time, as though the ball was coming toward him. Jason turned sharply, but there was nothing. He took a few steps, then paused. The feeling of being watched grew stronger. He glanced up at the scoreboard. It read 11:57 p.m., only 3 more minutes until midnight, and then the game would officially be tomorrow. He dismissed the thought. It was just his imagination. He was just nervous, that's all. But then, a chill ran through his body and he felt a sudden weight in the air. The basketball hoop, which had been still only moments ago, began to sway ever so slightly as if a breeze had blown through. The temperature in the gym seemed to drop. He rubbed his arms, trying to warm himself, but the cold lingered. Suddenly, the lights flickered, casting long, eerie shadows across the court. Jason's breath hitched in his throat, and his heart began to race. There was a noise now, a scraping sound like sneakers on the court. Jason's eyes darted to the center of the gym where he swore he saw a shadow move. "Hello?" he called out, his voice trembling. No answer. The lights flickered again, and when they came back on, the shadow was gone. Jason stood frozen, staring at the spot where the shadow had been. His mind raced. Maybe it was just the stress of the game. Maybe he was imagining things. He wasn't the type of person to believe in ghosts. But the feeling in the air, the chill that hadn't gone away, told him something was off. With a deep breath, Jason turned to leave. But then he heard the sound again, the faintest bounce of a basketball, this time coming from the far corner of the gym. The noise was unmistakable. Jason's heart skipped a beat. His hand went instinctively to his phone, but when he glanced at the screen, the clock read 12 a.m. Midnight. The gym was no longer the same. The air was thick with something Jason couldn't describe, something heavy. He felt his legs move as if they were being guided, his body taken over by an unseen force. Without realizing it, he found himself walking toward the corner of the gym, and that's when he saw it. There, in the farthest corner of the gym, stood a figure. It was tall and slender, draped in a dark, old-fashioned basketball uniform. The number on the uniform was faded, but it appeared to be 12, the same number Tommy Wells had worn in his playing days. The figure turned, and Jason's breath caught in his throat as he saw the faint outline of a face that was almost skeletal, pale and drawn with hollow eyes that seemed to pierce through him. There was no mistaking it now. This was no ordinary man. This was the ghost of Tommy Wells. Jason couldn't move. His feet were frozen to the floor as the figure slowly walked toward him. The ghost's feet didn't touch the ground. They hovered just inches above it. Jason wanted to scream, but his voice was lost in his throat. The ghost stopped in front of him, and Jason could feel the air grow colder. The ghost's lips parted, and in a voice that was both a whisper and a roar, it spoke. "You'll never escape it. You'll never finish the game," the ghost rasped, his voice full of bitterness. "This court, it's where I fell. And now, you'll fall too." Jason's pulse quickened as the figure reached out toward him, its cold, skeletal hand inches from his face. Just as it was about to touch him, Jason broke free of his paralysis and bolted for the door, slamming it behind him as he ran down the hallway, his heart pounding in his chest. The whispers of the ghost still echoed in his mind as he ran, desperate to escape the nightmare. He didn't stop running until he reached his car, breathless and shaken. It was only when he sat in the driver's seat that he realized he had just narrowly avoided becoming a part of the tragedy that had haunted Ridgeway High for over 50 years. The next night, despite his best efforts, Jason couldn't shake the feeling of the gym and the ghostly figure of Tommy Wells. As the game approached, he could barely focus. But there was something else. Something inside him told him he had to play, not just for his team, but to finally end the curse that had haunted the court for so long. But when the game finally arrived, as Jason stepped onto the court, he couldn't escape the lingering sensation of being watched. And when the final buzzer rang and the Falcons were victorious, Jason realized that Tommy Wells' spirit had never really left. It was still on that court, still haunting, still waiting. Story the end.
Story number 7.
The wind howled through the empty bleachers of Ironwood High's football field. The place was ancient, older than the school itself, built on the remnants of an old mining town. Some said the land was cursed. Others said the field itself was alive, hungry for blood and suffering. For the Ironwood Titans, it was home. Coach Henderson didn't believe in curses, ghosts, or the ridiculous stories passed down from past players. He was a man of discipline, a former Marine who had seen real horror in combat. Ghost stories were for children. But his team his boys, they weren't so sure. It had started small, a light flickering, locker doors swinging open on their own. Then the weird injuries. Players twisting ankles on flat ground, helmets disappearing, a playbook found torn to shreds in the middle of the locker room. The seniors on the team whispered about the minor. Every football team in Ironwood had their ghost story. Theirs was about a miner from the 1920s named Samuel Grayson, a man who had died in an accident beneath the very ground the football field was built on. Some said he still roamed the land, lost, angry. He had no love for the living, especially not for the ones who disturbed his rest. And the Titans disturbed him every Friday night. It all came to a head during the homecoming game. The stands were packed, the entire town watching as Ironwood took on their biggest rivals, the Fairview Panthers. The Titans were down by a touchdown with only minutes left in the fourth quarter. The fog rolled in thick, swallowing the field. It wasn't uncommon for the mist to creep in late in the season, but this was different. It wasn't natural. It moved like it had a purpose, cutting off visibility, curling around players' legs. Then the screaming started. Not from the crowd, from the field. Jason Bell, the Titans star wide receiver, collapsed mid-play. No one had touched him. His arms flailed like he was fighting something unseen, his cleats scraping against the turf. He screamed in terror, clutching at his leg like something was dragging him down. The refs blew the whistle, but Jason wasn't moving. Coach Henderson and the trainers sprinted out to him. When they got there, Jason's face was pale, his eyes wide with a horror that didn't belong on a high school football field. He clutched his ankle, muttering, "He grabbed me. He grabbed me." The trainer pulled up his pant leg. There, on his bare skin, was a handprint. Not a bruise. Not dirt. An actual blackened handprint, like someone had seared it into his flesh. The game stopped. No one knew what to do. Players from both teams refused to go back onto the field. The refs, shaken, called the game off. That night, Jason was hospitalized with second-degree burns on his leg. The doctors had no explanation. The field was quiet for days. Coach Henderson told the boys it was mass hysteria. There's no ghost, no minor. It's just your mind's playing tricks on you. But they knew better. Then came the last game of the season. The town was tense. Rumors spread that the team wanted to forfeit, but that wasn't an option. Ironwood was a football town, and football towns didn't quit. The game started like any other. The Titans were playing well, but there was something off. The air was heavy, charged. The lights flickered, buzzing angrily. The wind picked up, howling through the stadium. And then it happened. Midway through the second quarter, quarterback Derek Lawson dropped back for a pass, and the ground swallowed him. It wasn't a pothole. It wasn't turf giving way. 1 second, he was standing, eyes scanning for an open receiver. The next, his legs were gone, but half sinking into the earth as if it had turned to quicksand. He screamed. His teammates rushed toward him, but the ground buckled as if pushing them back. Derek clawed at the grass, his eyes wide in terror. Then, just as suddenly as it started, it stopped. The earth released him. Derek scrambled back, panting, his uniform coated in dirt. His cleats were gone, sucked into the ground. The game was over. The Titans never played on that field again. 2 weeks later, an excavation crew came to investigate the sinkhole that had opened. What they found made the news. Bones. Human bones. An entire skeleton buried beneath the 50-yard line. The coroner confirmed it was a miner from the 1920s, Samuel Grayson. The team moved their games to a different stadium after that. But sometimes when the wind is just right, you can still hear it. Cleats scraping against the turf, a whisper in the fog. The miner isn't done playing. Story. The end.
Story number 8.
The stadium lights buzzed and flickered, casting long shadows across the worn-out turf of Blackridge High's football field. The air was thick with the scent of damp earth and cut grass, and a slow, creeping mist rolled in from the nearby woods. It was homecoming week, the biggest event of the season, but no one on the Blackridge Titans wanted to be out there late at night, not after what had happened the year before. Some of the seniors still wouldn't talk about it. Some had transferred out of the school entirely. The official story was that their former kicker, Nathan Grady, had quit football, but the truth was, no one had seen him since the last homecoming game. Coach Vance didn't believe in the stories. You want to talk about ghosts, go join the drama club. We've got a game to win, he snapped at the team during practice. But the whispers didn't stop. The legend of Black Ridge Field went back decades, long before any of the current players were born. The school had been built over an old train yard, and the field itself stood on what had once been a switch station. The locals called it the track. The story went that back in the 1940s, a worker named James Cutter had been crushed between two cars in a rail accident late one foggy night. He hadn't died right away. People said he dragged himself across the tracks, his broken body leaving a trail of blood through the dirt, trying to reach the signal box. He never made it, and some folks claimed he still hadn't left. At first, it was just little things, the way the fog always seemed heavier on the field than anywhere else in town. Strange, cold spots on the sidelines, no matter how warm the night was. Then came the accidents. Players tripping on nothing, sudden injuries with no clear cause. More than once, a kicker would plant his foot for a field goal and feel the ground give way beneath him as if something was pulling him down. But the worst was Nathan Grady. It was the last play of the homecoming game. The Titans were down by 2 points, but Nathan had a clear shot at the winning field goal. The snap was good. The hold was perfect. He took his steps, planted his foot, and screamed. His teammates watched in horror as he crumpled to the ground, clutching his leg, his face twisted in agony. He was howling, sobbing, his eyes locked on the ground beneath him. The trainers ran onto the field, but as soon as they reached him, Nathan went silent. His body went limp. His eyes stared blankly at the sky. They rushed him to the hospital, but when they got there, he was unresponsive. He wasn't dead, his heart was still beating, but he never woke up. And then one night, he vanished from his hospital bed. Security cameras caught nothing. No one saw him leave. It was like he had just disappeared. After that, the Black Ridge Titans struggled to fill the kicker position. No one wanted the job. Every practice, every game, it felt like something was waiting. Now, a year later, the team had no choice but to find a new kicker for homecoming. That's where Evan Carter came in. Evan was a sophomore, new to the team, and too young to remember the full horror of last year. He'd heard the stories, of course, but he didn't believe them. "It's just bad luck," he told the other guys. "I'm not scared of some stupid ghost story." On the night of the game, the fog was heavier than ever, thick as smoke. The Titans were struggling, down by a single point in the fourth quarter. Then came the moment. 3 seconds left. Field goal range. Evan jogged onto the field, shaking out his arms, trying to ignore the way the hairs on his neck stood up. The crowd was screaming, but the field itself felt eerily silent, as if the fog had swallowed all the sound. He lined up the kick. The snap came. The hold was clean. Evan stepped forward, and suddenly the ground beneath him wasn't there anymore. He wasn't falling. He was sinking. Cold, iron fingers clamped around his ankle, yanking him downward into the dirt. The stadium lights dimmed. The sound of the crowd warped and distant, as if coming from miles away. Evan tried to scream, but the air left his lungs. The field twisted around him, the turf dissolving into blackened soil, train tracks emerging beneath his feet. The roar of a distant train filled his ears, metal grinding, a deep, shuddering horn that rattled his bones. And then he saw him. A figure standing just past the goalposts, shrouded in mist, his body broken and twisted like something half-crushed under a locomotive. His eyes were empty sockets, his mouth open in a silent scream. James Cutter. Evan thrashed, trying to free himself from the invisible grip, but the fingers only tightened, pulling him deeper into the ground. Then just as suddenly as it began, it stopped. The fog cleared. The noise of the crowd rushed back. Evan found himself lying flat on his back, the football rolling to a stop beside him. The refs were blowing their whistles. His teammates were shouting. He had missed. The game was over. The Titans had lost. And Evan knew in that moment that they weren't supposed to win. Not here. Not on Cutter's field. After that night, Evan quit football. The stories about the Black Ridge Curse spread further, and the school started looking for a new place to build a stadium. But those who were there that night, those who had seen what happened to Evan, they knew the truth. The track still belonged to James Cutter, and he wasn't done collecting. Story the end.
Story number 9.
It was a crisp fall evening in 1998 when I first stepped onto the turf at Whitmore Field. The air smelled faintly of autumn leaves, and the sky was painted in hues of orange and pink as if nature itself were giving us a send-off for what promised to be the biggest game of our high school football season. The Whitmore Wildcats were our bitter rivals, and tonight was the night we were going to settle it. I was just 17, a senior starting quarterback, and I had trained all my life for moments like these. My dream was to lead my team to a championship, to put our small town on the map, and to finally get some college scouts interested in me. The crowd was raucous, the energy was high, and the stakes couldn't have been clearer. I had always heard the rumors about Whitmore Field. Some said it was haunted, a place where players who had died young during games still roamed. But those were just stories, old tales that parents and coaches passed down to us as part of the tradition. I didn't believe in ghosts. I never had. But the moment I stepped onto that field, I felt something that I couldn't explain, a cold, creeping unease that ran up my spine. I tried to ignore it, telling myself it was just nerves, just the adrenaline of the big game. My teammates didn't seem to notice anything off. They were busy gearing up for the game, laughing, chatting, and trying to focus on their plays. Still, that feeling lingered in the back of my mind. The lights overhead flickered for a second as I stood near the goalposts, looking out at the stadium. It was as if the field itself was watching us. I shook my head, trying to clear the thoughts. We had a game to win. The whistle blew, and we kicked off to start the first quarter. The Wildcats came charging at us, their dark uniforms blending into the shadows of the night. The ball snapped to me, and the game was underway. At first, everything was as it should be. The sound of cleats pounding on the turf, the cheering crowd, the smell of freshly cut grass, everything felt normal. But then something strange happened. As we pushed down the field, nearing the red zone, I began to hear whispers. At first, I thought it was just the wind, but it was different, softer, more distinct. I couldn't make out the words, but there was a rhythm to it, almost like chanting. I looked around, but all I saw were the players running, focused on the game. No one seemed to notice the murmurs in the air. I dismissed it. It was just the noise of the crowd mixed with the wind, I reasoned. But as the night wore on, things began to escalate. The further we got into the game, the more unsettling the atmosphere became. I was getting the ball, leading our offense, but every pass I threw seemed to go longer than expected. Every play we ran felt like we were being watched from all directions, like there was something or someone just out of my line of sight. It wasn't until the third quarter that things took a truly bizarre turn. We were up by 2 touchdowns, and the game seemed to be slipping away from the Wildcats. I'd just thrown a touchdown pass, and the team was energized. We lined up for the kickoff, and I looked up toward the stands. That's when I saw him. A man sitting in the very last row, right at the top of the bleachers near the farthest corner. He was an older man with graying hair and a weathered face, dressed in a faded jacket. There was something about his stillness, his lack of movement, that struck me as odd. He wasn't clapping, wasn't cheering. He was just sitting there, staring down at the field, watching us intently. I shook my head, trying to focus back on the game, but I couldn't stop looking at him. There was a strange aura around the man, a sense of unease that made my skin crawl. I blinked, and when I looked back up, he was gone. I dismissed it as a trick of the light, maybe some fan who had left early. It was a big stadium, after all, and the crowd was so loud that it was easy to overlook things. But then the whispers started again. This time, they were louder, clearer. I could hear actual words, although they didn't make sense. Get out! Leave this place! The voices were everywhere, coming from all sides, as though the wind itself had been possessed by something malevolent. My hands were sweating. My heart was racing. I couldn't focus. I called a play, but the ball slipped from my hands. I tried to grab it, but it felt like it had been tampered with, like someone else was holding on to it. It wasn't just nerves anymore. I felt it. An energy was trying to push me, to control me. I called a timeout, running to the sideline, my legs shaking as I tried to regain my composure. Coach Thompson was talking, but his words seemed to blur in my ears. All I could hear were the whispers, clear as day, coming from the stands, coming from the field itself. You can't escape. You belong here. I looked up at the stands again, and there he was, the man. Only now he was standing at the top of the bleachers, staring directly at me. His eyes were empty, hollow. He didn't blink, didn't move. just stood there, his gaze fixed on mine as if he were daring me to challenge him. My heart pounded in my chest. I wanted to turn away, to stop looking at him, but I couldn't. I was paralyzed by his presence. "Coach, I need a break," I muttered, barely audible. "Focus," Coach Thompson snapped, but I could barely hear him. The whispers were too loud, drowning out everything else. "Get back in there. You've got this." But I didn't have it. I didn't have anything. I couldn't breathe, couldn't think. I turned and jogged to the sideline, desperate to get away from the field, from the man. The second I stepped off the grass, I felt the weight lift from my chest, and for the first time in what felt like hours, I could breathe again. I sat down on the bench, trying to calm myself, but the panic wouldn't subside. I kept my eyes locked on the field, trying to make sense of what was happening, but everything around me seemed distorted. The sounds were muffled, like I was hearing them underwater. The players on the field, the cheering crowd, they all seemed distant. Everything felt wrong, and I could feel it deep in my gut. Something was watching me, waiting. Suddenly, there was a loud crack, and the lights above us flickered, casting long shadows over the field. The crowd went quiet, as if the entire stadium had just taken a collective breath. And in that moment, I saw it, the man. But this time, he wasn't in the stands, he was on the field. The figure was now wearing a faded football uniform, number 47. The same number worn by a former player of ours who had died years ago in a car accident. He wasn't running, wasn't tackling. He was standing at the center of the field, his eyes locked on me, his presence towering over the game like a dark omen. I couldn't look away. I was rooted to the spot. The whispers grew louder, now a cacophony in my mind. "You're next. You're next." And then the ball snapped. The game continued, but I wasn't part of it anymore. My body moved on autopilot as I ran the plays, threw the passes, but I wasn't truly there. All I could hear was the voice, threatening, mocking. Leave this place." The final whistle blew. We had won the game, but it didn't feel like a victory. The stadium erupted in cheers, but I couldn't hear them. I could only hear the whispers. And the figure standing at the center of the field, waiting. I walked off the field, my legs weak, my mind racing. I couldn't shake the feeling that something had happened to me that night, something I couldn't explain. I tried to push it all away, but the whispers followed me, even as I left the stadium behind. Weeks later, I heard about a tragedy. The man I had seen on the field, the man who had been wearing number 47, was none other than Zachary Miller, a former star player who had died in a mysterious accident at the stadium in 1978. His death was never fully explained, but rumors swirled that he had been a victim of something dark that lingered at Whitmore Field. I never played at Whitmore again. The whispers and the figure haunted me, and I eventually left football altogether, unable to shake the fear that something darker than a game had taken place that night. Story the end.
Story number 10.
The air was thick with tension on the night of the championship game. The gym was packed, the crowd's cheers reverberating off the walls, and the hardwood floor beneath the players' feet seemed to hum with the energy of the moment. It was the final game of the season for the town of Lancaster, and the rivalry between Lancaster High and their longtime opponents, the Greenfield Hornets, had reached a fever pitch. For as long as anyone could remember, the two schools had been neck and neck, but this year was different. Lancaster had a star player, Matt Walker, who had been the centerpiece of the team all season. With his quick feet and sharp eye for the basket, Matt was a local legend, and everyone knew that this would be his moment. The championship was within reach, but there was something in the air, a sense that not everything was as it seemed. Matt had been hearing strange things lately. Whispers from teammates, rumors of an old ghost haunting the court. At first, he thought it was just superstition, but as the days wore on, he couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching him. Matt had grown up in Lancaster, and he had heard the stories since he was a child. The gym had a long history, one that spanned back more than a century. The school had been built on the site of an old, now demolished arena, a place where basketball had been played long before the current gym was constructed. The local legend centered around a player named Billy Hayes, who had been the best of the best back in the 1930s. Billy had been Lancaster's star, like Matt was now. But tragedy struck just before the biggest game of his life. Billy was supposed to lead the team to a state title, but during a practice just days before the game, something went horribly wrong. He was practicing his layups when he took a jump and landed wrong, snapping his leg so violently that the sound echoed across the empty gym. The injury was career-ending, and Billy never got the chance to play in the championship game. The team lost that year, and rumors spread about Billy's death in the months that followed. Some said he had never truly recovered from the heartbreak of never playing in the championship, and that he had taken his own life in that very gym. For decades, players had sworn they could feel his presence, some even claiming to have seen his figure lingering in the shadows of the bleachers or on the court. Matt didn't believe in such things. He was focused on the game, on winning. But as the championship game drew closer, he began to wonder if there was some truth to the story. That night, the energy in the gym was unlike anything Matt had ever experienced. The atmosphere was charged, the sound of the crowd deafening. The Greenfield Hornets were a tough team, and the game was neck and neck. Matt's team was holding strong, but there was a palpable sense of unease in the air. As the fourth quarter wound down and the score was tied, Matt could feel his heart pounding in his chest. His teammates were all giving it their all, but he could sense that something was off. It wasn't just the pressure of the game. There was something else in the air, something that made the hairs on the back of his neck stand up. Then, with only 30 seconds left in the game, Matt caught a glimpse of something out of the corner of his eye. A figure standing at the far end of the gym. It was a tall, shadowy shape, partially obscured in the darkness, standing alone beneath the bleachers. Matt blinked, but when he looked again, the figure was gone. Shaking his head, Matt turned his attention back to the game. But the strange sensation lingered. His legs felt heavier than usual, his movements slightly off, as if someone or something was pushing back against him. He tried to focus, to shake off the growing unease. This was the moment he had trained for. This was his game. He had to win. The ball came to him, and for a moment, time seemed to slow down. He could hear his heartbeat thudding in his ears as he dribbled toward the basket. The crowd's cheers faded, replaced by a strange, quiet whisper. His vision narrowed, and he could feel the weight of the gym pressing down on him. The ball was in his hands, and the basket was so close. But there was something else, something in the back of his mind that told him not to shoot, to stop, to run. Suddenly, everything went dark. The lights flickered once, twice, and then shut off completely, plunging the gym into total darkness. The crowd fell silent in confusion. Matt's heart raced. He couldn't see anything, but he could hear the soft shuffle of feet, the whispers in the darkness. He strained his eyes, trying to adjust to the lack of light. Then, in the distance, he saw it again, the shadowy figure standing near the bleachers, closer this time, watching him. The whispers grew louder, echoing in his mind. He couldn't understand them, but the voice, it was familiar. The figure moved, its outline flickering as though it were part of the shadows themselves. Matt's pulse quickened. He took a step back, but the figure stepped forward in response. And then, just as quickly, the lights flickered back on, and the gym erupted into noise again. Matt blinked, disoriented. The figure was gone, but something was different. The air felt colder now, heavier, and Matt could still hear the faint whispers, like the rustling of paper or the sound of something moving just out of reach. He looked around, but his teammates were still huddled around, ready to play. The scoreboard showed 30 seconds left, just as it had before the lights went out. The game was still tied. Everyone was focused on the court, but Matt felt as though he had just stepped out of reality for a brief moment. He had lost time. He had lost control. With his heart still pounding, he dribbled the ball and moved toward the basket again. He didn't know why, but he felt compelled to make the shot. His legs moved on their own, carrying him forward with mechanical precision. He reached the three-point line, squared up, and took the shot. It flew through the air, spinning toward the hoop. As it neared the rim, the gym seemed to fall into a strange stillness. Matt watched as the ball seemed to slow down, floating almost impossibly in the air before finally dropping through the net. The crowd erupted into cheers, but Matt stood frozen in place, staring at the spot where the figure had stood just moments before. He could still feel its presence, like a weight on his chest. And then, from the back of the gym, he heard it, the faintest sound of a basketball bouncing. It was soft, almost as if it were far away. But Matt's heart skipped a beat as he realized the sound was coming from the empty corner of the court. He didn't look back. He couldn't. He had won. They had won. But something told him that the victory wasn't over yet, that the gym, that the court, would always be haunted by the shadows of the past. The next morning, Matt tried to push it all from his mind. He was a champion now, his name etched in the history of Lancaster High. The team celebrated, the town celebrated, but Matt couldn't shake the unease that lingered in the back of his mind. That night, as he lay in bed, he couldn't stop thinking about the ghostly figure and the strange events that had happened during the game. What if it had all been real? What if Billy Hayes, the ghost of the gym, had really been there, guiding his hand to make the shot ensuring Lancaster's victory? As the years went by, the story of Matt's championship game became just another chapter in the town's long history of sports legends. But Matt never returned to the gym. He couldn't. He had heard the whispers too many times, and every time he passed the school, the strange feeling of being watched came back. He never spoke of what had happened, not even to his closest friends. But every time he passed that gym, he felt it. The weight of the past, the lingering presence of a player who had never finished what he started, the ghost of Billy Hayes, who still roamed the court, watching for the next chance to claim a victory. Story, the end.